There are sounds that haunt you forever. The creak of the third step from the bottom, the soft click of a door handle turning in the darkness, the rustle of medical equipment being arranged on a nightstand. These sounds live in my bones even now, 43 years later. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I am 78 years old. I live in a quiet apartment in Portland, Oregon, where rain taps gently against my windows, and no one enters my bedroom without permission. But for the first 18 years of my life, I lived in terror in a house on Elm Street in Hartford, Connecticut, where my father, Dr. Richard Sullivan, practiced medicine by day and committed unspeakable crimes by night. This is the story I've carried in silence for decades. It's the story of how I learned to survive, to escape, and ultimately to transform my pain into purpose. But mostly, it's the story of finding my voice in a world that preferred my silence. The abuse began on a Tuesday night in March 1952, 3 days after my 7th birthday. I remember the date because I had been so excited about starting 2nd grade the following week, chattering to my parents about my new teacher and the books I wanted to read. Quiet, Margaret. My mother, Helen, had said, not looking up from her needlework. Your father has had a long day at the hospital. We must let him rest. Rest. That word would take on a sinister meaning in the years that followed. That night, I was lying in my small bed, still wearing the pink nightgown Mother had given me for my birthday, when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. The door opened without a knock, something that had never happened before, but would become routine. Hello, sweetheart, he said softly, carrying his black medical bag. Daddy needs to check something. What happened next shattered my understanding of the world. The man I had trusted completely, the respected physician who healed sick children, became the source of my deepest terror. His hands, which I had seen gently examine patients in his clinic, violated me in ways my 7-year-old mind couldn't comprehend, but my body knew were wrong. This is our special secret, he whispered afterward, his stethoscope gleaming in the moonlight. Good daughters keep their father's secrets. You want to be a good daughter, don't you? I nodded, not because I understood, but because I was too frightened to do anything else. If you tell anyone, your mother, your teachers, anyone, something terrible will happen to them. And it will be your fault. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Do you understand me, Margaret? I understood enough to know that my childhood had ended in that moment. The visits became regular every Tuesday and Thursday night like clockwork. I learned to recognize the signs, the way he would tap his fingers against his coffee cup at dinner, the particular clearing of his throat when Mother mentioned her evening bridge games or church meetings. Those were the nights she would be gone, leaving me alone with him. By the time I turned 10, I had developed what I now recognize as hypervigilance. I could tell you the exact time he arrived home from work by the sound of his car in the driveway. I knew which floorboards creaked and how to avoid them. I memorized the schedule of every person in our household, mapping out the moments when I would be most vulnerable. Mother seemed to exist in a bubble of willful ignorance, humming while she cooked his favorite meals, and speaking of him with an admiration that made my stomach turn. Your father is such a dedicated doctor, she would tell the neighbors. He works so hard to help people. We're so blessed to have him. I wanted to scream that her blessed husband was destroying me piece by piece, but the words never came. Fear had stolen my voice as surely as if he had cut out my tongue. It was around this time that I began to notice things that didn't quite fit. Father would receive phone calls late at night, conversations he took in his study with the door closed. I could hear the low murmur of his voice, occasionally catching fragments, the usual protocol, or keeping the family satisfied. There were appointments in his calendar with colleagues noted in his careful handwriting with cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing to me then. One evening, while he was at what Mother called another medical conference, I crept into his study. Among the usual medical journals and patient files, I found a leather-bound appointment book. Flipping through it, I saw recurring meetings with names I recognized: Dr. Morrison, Dr. Fletcher, Dr. Hayes, all respected physicians in our community. But beside their names were strange notations, special consultations, family protocols, pediatric considerations. The words meant nothing to my 10-year-old mind, but something about the secretive way these appointments were recorded made my skin crawl. When I was 12, I made a discovery that changed everything. It happened on one of those terrible Thursday nights when Mother was at her church auxiliary meeting. As Father prepared for his visit to my room, I heard something small hit the floor, a glass vial that rolled under my dresser. After he left, I retrieved it with trembling hands. The label read, chloral hydrate, 500 milliliters. I had seen similar bottles in his medical bag, but I had never understood their purpose. The next day, while he was at his clinic, I snuck into his study and pulled down one of his medical textbooks. The words were complex, but desperation made me a quick learner. I discovered that chloral hydrate was a powerful sedative used to render patients unconscious during medical procedures. The implications hit me like a physical blow. He had been drugging me. All those nights when I had felt unusually drowsy, when my memories were hazy and fragmented, it hadn't been natural sleep. He had been calculating dosages using his medical knowledge to make me compliant. But as horrifying as this revelation was, it also gave me something I had never had before: concrete knowledge. I began studying his medical books whenever I could, learning about drugs and their effects, about dosages and interactions. Knowledge, I realized, might be the key to my survival. It was during one of these covert study sessions that I found the letters. Hidden beneath a stack of medical journals were envelopes addressed in feminine handwriting. The return address made my blood run cold. Mrs. Patricia Sullivan, 47 Elm Street, New Haven, CT. Sullivan was our last name, but my mother was Helen, not Patricia. With shaking hands, I opened one of the letters. "My dearest Richard," it began. "Little Emma asks about you every day. She misses her daddy terribly and wonders when you'll visit again. I know your work in Hartford keeps you busy, but please try to come home soon." The letter continued with domestic details about someone called Emma discussing her school activities and asking when Daddy would be coming to visit. My father had another family, another wife, another daughter. As the full scope of his deception became clear, I realized something that made me physically ill. If he had done these things to me, what was he doing to Emma? Living with this knowledge was almost unbearable. Every time Father left for one of his medical conferences, I knew he was likely going to New Haven to his other family. Every time he spoke about his dedication to helping children, I wondered if Emma was experiencing the same nightmares that plagued me. I began paying closer attention to his phone calls lingering outside his study door when I heard his voice. One conversation in particular chilled me to the bone. "She's getting older, Patricia," I heard him say. "More aware. We need to be careful about our approach." There was a long pause, then, "Of course I know what I'm doing. Trust me, I'm a doctor. I understand children better than anyone." Another pause, and his voice dropped lower. "The sedative works perfectly. She won't remember anything, just like we discussed with Morrison and the others." Morrison. I had seen that name in his appointment book. The puzzle pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. During this time, my relationship with Mother became increasingly strained. I desperately wanted her to notice something, to ask why I flinched when Father entered a room, why I had stopped eating his favorite foods, why I seemed to shrink into myself whenever he was around. One evening, after a particularly brutal night, I gathered the courage to test her awareness. "Mother," I said carefully as she prepared Father's breakfast, "I've been having trouble sleeping lately." "Oh." She didn't look up from scrambling his eggs. "Growing pains, I suppose. You're at that age. I have nightmares sometimes, about being hurt." This got her attention, but not in the way I had hoped. She set down her spatula and fixed me with a sharp look. "Margaret Sullivan, I don't want to hear any more of this foolishness. Your father works himself to the bone providing for this family, and the last thing he needs is to come home to a daughter spreading silly stories. But Mother, Enough! Her voice cracked like a whip. Your father is a respected physician. People in this community look up to him, depend on him. I won't have you saying things that could damage his reputation. The finality in her tone told me everything I needed to know. Even if I found the courage to tell her the truth, she wouldn't believe me. Or worse, she would choose not to believe me. That night, as I lay in bed waiting for the inevitable sound of Father's footsteps, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I couldn't save myself by appealing to my mother, but perhaps I could save Emma. The plan took months to develop. I needed to gather enough evidence to make my warning credible, and I needed to find a way to contact Patricia Sullivan without Father discovering what I had done. I began keeping a journal hidden beneath my mattress, documenting every detail I could remember. Dates, times, the specific drugs he used, the things he said. Writing it down was agonizing, but it also gave me a sense of control I had never experienced before. I also continued studying his medical books, learning not just about the drugs he used on me, but about the effects of trauma on children. For the first time, I began to understand that what was happening to me wasn't normal, wasn't something I had somehow caused or deserved. The medical knowledge proved crucial when I finally found my opportunity. Father had to attend a genuine medical conference in Boston. I confirmed this by calling the hospital directly and asking about the conference schedule. He would be gone for 3 days, and Mother was planning to visit her sister in Springfield. On the evening before they left, I crept into Father's study one final time. I photographed several pages from his appointment book with an old camera I had borrowed from a school friend, focusing on the cryptic notations beside his colleagues' names. I also copied down Patricia's address and phone number along with several passages from her letters. But most importantly, I wrote the letter that would change everything. Dear Mrs. Sullivan. I began, my hand trembling so badly I could barely form the letters. I don't know how to say this, but I believe your daughter Emma may be in danger. My name is Margaret, and I am also Dr. Sullivan's daughter. For the past 5 years, he has been. The rest of the letter poured out of me like water from a broken dam. I told Patricia about the abuse, about the drugs, about the pattern I had observed. I described the medical equipment he used, the specific medications, the things he said. I told her about the phone conversations I had overheard, about the appointments with his colleagues, about my growing fear that Emma was experiencing the same horrors I endured. I know this is hard to believe, I concluded, but I couldn't live with myself if something happened to Emma and I had stayed silent. Please watch her carefully. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I signed it simply, someone who cares about Emma's safety, and included no return address. Then I walked to the post office and mailed it to New Haven, praying that Patricia would take it seriously. For 3 days, I heard nothing. Father returned from his conference in good spirits, bringing Mother a small gift and telling stories about the latest advances in pediatric medicine. His normalcy felt like a mask that could slip at any moment. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after I had mailed the letter, the phone rang during dinner. Father answered with his usual professional courtesy, but I watched his face change as he listened to the voice on the other end. I see, he said finally, his knuckles white as he gripped the receiver. No, I understand completely. Yes, we should definitely discuss this in person. He hung up and turned to Mother, his expression carefully controlled. I need to drive to New Haven tonight. There's been a family emergency. What kind of emergency? Mother asked, her fork halfway to her mouth. Patricia's not feeling well. Some kind of nervous condition. I should be there to help. I knew he was lying. Patricia's letters had always portrayed her as healthy and energetic, focused on caring for Emma and maintaining their household. This was about something else entirely, something that had prompted her to call him directly rather than write one of her usual letters. After Father left, speeding toward New Haven, with a grim expression I had never seen before, I lay awake wondering what I had set in motion. By morning, I would have my answer. Father didn't return until late Friday night, and when he did, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in 2 days. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his hands shaking as he poured himself a large glass of whiskey, something I had never seen him do. Saturday morning at breakfast, the tension was so thick, it seemed to press against my skin. Mother chattered nervously about her garden club plans, but Father barely responded, his attention focused entirely on me. "Margaret," he said finally after Mother had excused herself to get ready for her meeting. "We need to talk." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "About what?" "About loyalty. About the importance of keeping family secrets." His eyes were bloodshot, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath. "About what happens to little girls who spread lies about their fathers." I met his gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage I hadn't known I possessed. "I haven't told any lies. Patricia received an interesting letter this week. Anonymous, of course. Someone claiming to know about our private family matters." "I don't know anything about that." He leaned across the table, bringing his face close to mine. "Don't play games with me, Margaret. I know it was you. The question is, what do we do about it now?" For a moment, I thought he might strike me. Instead, he sat back and took another sip of his whiskey. "Patricia has asked me to stay away from Emma," he said finally. "Permanently. She's concerned about some things the child has been saying." The relief that washed over me was so intense I nearly cried. Emma had found her voice. Patricia had listened. My letter had worked. "That's probably for the best," I said quietly. His laugh was bitter and hollow. "You have no idea what you've done. Do you? The damage you've caused?" "The only damage was what you caused. To me, to Emma, to both our families." "I never hurt you, Margaret. Everything I did was out of love, out of a father's natural affection for his daughter." The gaslighting was so audacious, so completely divorced from reality, that I found myself responding with a clarity I had never possessed before. Love doesn't require drugs and medical equipment. Love doesn't happen in secret. Love doesn't leave a child counting ceiling cracks and praying for morning. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that the frightened little girl he had terrorized was gone, replaced by someone he couldn't control. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" he said finally. "But you're still a child living in my house, dependent on my support. What exactly do you think your options are?" "I think," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, "that you're going to help me get into a good college far away from Hartford, and I think you're going to pay for it. Because the alternative is that I stop being anonymous when I write letters." The color drained from his face. "You wouldn't dare. Try me." We stared at each other across the breakfast table, and I realized that the balance of power in our house had shifted permanently. For the first time in my life, I held the stronger hand. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to leave me alone completely. No more visits to my room, no more touching, no more drugs. I want you to help me get into college somewhere far from here. And I want you to make sure Emma stays safe. And in return, I keep quiet about everything. Your reputation stays intact." He considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. But if you ever try to cross me again—" "I won't," I said. "As long as you keep your end of the deal." He stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Mother grew her prized roses. "You know, Margaret," he said without turning around, "I always knew you were the smart one. I just never realized how dangerous that would make you." After he left the room, I sat alone at the breakfast table and cried for the first time in years. They weren't tears of sadness or fear, but of relief so profound, it felt like being reborn. The remainder of my high school years passed in a strange sort of peace. Father kept his word. He never entered my room uninvited again, never touched me inappropriately, never forced me to take his medications. But the house remained tense, filled with unspoken truths and carefully maintained distances. Mother noticed the change in our family dynamic, though she couldn't identify its source. One afternoon, as we folded laundry together, she made an observation that revealed more about her awareness than she probably intended. "You and your father seem so distant lately," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "It's like you're both walking on eggshells around each other." "People change as they grow up, Mother. Relationships evolve." She was quiet for a moment, smoothing wrinkles from one of Father's shirts with unusual care. "Sometimes I wonder if I've been a good mother to you, Margaret. If I've paid attention to the right things." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us was prepared to address directly. I could see the shadow of knowledge in her eyes, the terrible suspicion she had been fighting for years. "You've been the best mother you knew how to be," I said finally, and I meant it. Her willful blindness had been a survival mechanism, just as my silence had been mine. Have I, though?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes at night I used to hear, sounds that didn't seem right. But I told myself I was imagining things that it wasn't my place to question." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, and I realized she was asking for absolution I couldn't give her. "Mother," I said gently, "the most important thing now is moving forward. Making sure nothing like that ever happens again." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes, and we finished the laundry in silence. It was the closest we would ever come to acknowledging the truth of what had happened in our house. And while it wasn't the confrontation I had sometimes imagined, it was enough. During this time, I threw myself into my studies with renewed passion. My grades had always been good, but now they became exceptional. I devoured books on psychology, sociology, and child development, beginning to understand my experiences within a broader context of trauma and recovery. I also began writing letters to colleges, focusing on institutions with strong psychology programs located far from Connecticut. The University of Oregon became my first choice, not just because of their excellent academic reputation, but because it represented everything Hartford wasn't. Open skies, clean air, and thousands of miles between me and my father's secrets. In April of my senior year, I received the acceptance letter that would change my life. The University of Oregon had not only accepted me into their psychology program, but had offered me a partial scholarship and a work-study position that would cover most of my remaining expenses. I held the letter in my shaking hands, reading it over and over until the words blurred with my tears. Freedom had an address, Eugene, Oregon, 3,000 miles away from Elm Street. That evening, I presented the letter to my parents at dinner. Mother's reaction was everything I could have hoped for: pride, excitement, and just a touch of maternal worry about her daughter moving so far from home. Father's response was more complex. I watched him read the acceptance letter carefully, his expression unreadable. "Psychology," he said finally. "An interesting choice. I want to help children," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "Children who have been hurt." Something flickered across his face. Fear, perhaps, or recognition of the threat implicit in my words. "That's admirable," he said carefully. "Though it can be difficult work, emotionally taxing. I think I can handle it." He set down the letter and looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I believe you can." True to his promise, Father arranged for my college expenses to be covered through what he told Mother were educational savings he had been building for years. The money came through a trust fund that ensured I would never have to ask him for financial help again, a gift that was as much about his desire to distance himself from me as it was about fulfilling our agreement. In August, as I packed my belongings for the cross-country journey to Oregon, Father appeared in my doorway one final time. I tensed, automatically, old fears rising to the surface, despite everything that had changed between us. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small wrapped box. Inside was a beautiful fountain pen engraved with my initials. "For your writing," he said. "I suspect you're going to do important things with words someday." It was such an unexpectedly thoughtful gift that I didn't know how to respond. This was the man who had terrorized me for years, but also the man who was making my freedom possible. "Thank you," I said finally. He nodded and turned to go, but paused at the doorway. "Margaret," he said without looking back, "I hope you find what you're looking for out there. I hope you find peace." It was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and while it wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, it was something. Oregon was everything I had dreamed it would be and more. The campus was beautiful, nestled among green hills that seemed to stretch endlessly toward clean horizons. My dormitory roommate Susan was a cheerful girl from Portland who talked constantly about her loving family and seemed to assume everyone else shared her positive childhood experiences. I let her assume. My psychology classes captivated me from the first day. Professor Elizabeth Warren, who taught my Introduction to Abnormal Psychology course, became an immediate mentor. She was a small, fierce woman in her 50s who had built a reputation for her groundbreaking research on childhood trauma. "You show unusual insight into the material, Miss Sullivan," she told me after my first major exam. "Have you considered specializing in childhood trauma and recovery?" "Yes, ma'am, I have." She studied me with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. "If you're serious about this field, you should know that it requires a special kind of strength. You'll be working with children who have experienced things most people can't imagine. You'll need to find ways to help them heal while protecting your own emotional well-being." "I understand. I hope you do, because the children who come to us for help deserve therapists who have done their own work, who understand the journey from victim to survivor." Her words stayed with me as I threw myself into my studies. I was earning top grades and gaining the attention of my professors, but I was also struggling with aspects of college life I hadn't anticipated. Social situations felt overwhelming. I found it difficult to trust male professors or classmates. Loud noises made me jump. Closed doors made me panic. It was during my sophomore year, during a particularly difficult period, when nightmares had returned with renewed intensity, that I finally sought help from the campus counseling center. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez was a gentle woman in her 40s who specialized in trauma therapy. Our first session was awkward, filled with my deflections and her patient persistence. By our third meeting, I had broken down completely and told her everything. "Margaret, she said after I had finished my story, "I want you to understand something very important. What happened to you was not your fault. You were a child. You were powerless. The adult who should have protected you chose to hurt you instead, and that says everything about him and nothing about you." The words were ones I had read in textbooks, ones I had even repeated to myself. But hearing them spoken with such conviction by a professional I was learning to trust made them feel real for the first time. "How do I stop feeling like it's still happening?" I asked. "How do I stop being afraid?" "Healing isn't linear," she said gently. "There will be good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. But every time you choose to trust someone, every time you speak your truth, every time you use your experience to help another person, you're proving that he didn't win. You're proving that survivors can do more than just survive, they can thrive." It was through Dr. Rodriguez's encouragement that I began volunteering at a local crisis center for children. The work was emotionally challenging, but it also provided me with a sense of purpose I had never experienced before. It was there that I met David Chen, a graduate student in social work who was also volunteering at the center. David was kind, patient, and had an intuitive way with traumatized children that reminded me of everything a father should be, but mine never was. We worked together on several cases, and I found myself looking forward to our shifts together. David had a way of making me feel safe that was entirely new to me, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through consistent kindness and respect for my boundaries. One evening, as we walked back to campus after a particularly difficult case involving a 7-year-old girl who reminded me painfully of myself. At that age, David asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Margaret, can I ask you something personal?" Every alarm bell in my body went off. "What kind of personal You work so hard with these kids, and you're incredibly good at it. But sometimes, I see this look in your eyes like you're remembering something painful. I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The kindness in his voice almost undid me. I had grown so accustomed to hiding my pain to presenting a facade of normalcy that having someone notice and care felt revolutionary. "Thank you," I managed. "That means a lot." We continued walking in comfortable silence, but something had shifted between us. Over the following weeks, David began including me in his study groups, inviting me to coffee, asking my opinion on cases we were working on together. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, never made me feel pressured or trapped. Slowly, carefully, I began to trust him with pieces of my story. Not everything I wasn't ready for that yet, but enough for him to understand why certain things triggered my anxiety, why I sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly, why I needed to sit facing the door in restaurants. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said one afternoon as we sat in the campus coffee shop. "But I want you to know that whatever happened to you, it doesn't change how I see you. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." His acceptance of my brokenness, his patience with my healing process, began to chip away at the walls I had built around my heart. For the first time since childhood, I began to imagine a future that included trust, intimacy, and maybe even love. David and I dated for 2 years before I finally told him the complete truth. We had been walking along the river that ran through Eugene, enjoying one of Oregon's rare sunny days, when he brought up a subject I had been dreading. "Margaret, I've been thinking about our future together. About the possibility of marriage, maybe starting a family someday." My heart clenched with fear and longing in equal measure. I wanted those things with him, wanted them desperately. But I also knew he deserved to make that decision with full knowledge of who I really was. David," I said, stopping beside a bench overlooking the water. "There are things about my past that you need to know. Things that might change how you feel about me." He sat down beside me, taking my hand gently. "Nothing could change how I feel about you." "Don't say that until you've heard everything." And so, sitting by that peaceful river with the man I loved holding my hand, I told him the whole truth. I told him about my father's visits to my room, about the drugs, about the years of fear and silence. I told him about discovering the second family, about writing the letter that saved Emma, and about the confrontation that finally ended my father's access to both his daughters. David listened without interrupting his grip on my hand, never wavering, even as I saw tears gathering in his eyes. "My God, Margaret," he said when I finished. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry you had to carry it alone for so long." "Are you sure you still want to be with me? I understand if this changes things. I'm damaged, David. I might never be completely normal." He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes fierce with emotion. "Listen to me very carefully," he said. "You are not damaged. You are a survivor. You took something horrible and transformed it into a calling to help other children. You saved your half-sister from experiencing what you went through. You're the bravest person I've ever known. But what if I can't be the wife you deserve? What if I can't have children because I'm too afraid I'll fail to protect them the way my mother failed to protect me?" "Then we'll figure it out together," he said simply. "Whatever you need, whatever you can or can't do, we'll face it as a team. That's what love is, Margaret. It's not about perfection. It's about choosing each other, broken pieces and all." That night, for the first time in my adult life, I slept peacefully in someone's arms. The nightmares that had plagued me for years seemed to lose their power in the face of David's unwavering acceptance and love. David and I were married in a small ceremony the summer after I graduated. It was held in a garden outside Portland, surrounded by friends from school, and David's wonderful family, who had welcomed me with open arms despite knowing little about my background. Mother came out for the wedding, looking older than I remembered, but genuinely happy for me. She had softened somewhat in the years since I left home, and while we never spoke directly about the past, there was an understanding between us that hadn't existed before. Father was notably absent. Mother explained that he was attending a medical conference, but I suspected he simply couldn't face seeing me in such a moment of triumph and joy. Dr. Warren attended the ceremony along with several other professors who had become mentors during my undergraduate years. Seeing all these people who believed in me, who had supported my healing and growth, felt like a validation of everything I had fought to achieve. David and I settled in Portland, where he began working for the State Department of Human Services, and I started graduate school in clinical psychology. We bought a small house with a garden where I could grow the flowers I had dreamed of during those dark years on Elm Street. For the first time in my life, I felt truly safe and loved. My doctoral research focused on resilience factors in childhood sexual abuse survivors, examining what allowed some children to not just survive their trauma, but to transform it into a source of strength and purpose. It was deeply personal research disguised as academic work, an attempt to understand not just what had happened to me, but how I had managed to build a meaningful life despite it. The work caught the attention of researchers across the country and led to my first job offer, a position at Portland State University as both a professor and a clinician specializing in childhood trauma. My patient caseload was heavy, filled with children and adolescents whose stories echoed my own in painful ways. There was 8-year-old Tommy, whose stepfather had been helping him with baths in ways that left the boy terrified of water. 12-year-old Maria, who flinched whenever adults raised their voices, because her father's rages always ended with him forcing her into his bedroom. 15-year-old James, who had been trafficked by his own mother and couldn't understand why no one had protected him. Each case broke my heart and strengthened my resolve in equal measure. These children needed someone who truly understood what they were experiencing, someone who could guide them from victim to survivor, because she had made that journey herself. One case in particular tested everything I had learned about healing and trust. Sarah was a 13-year-old girl referred by her school counselor after exhibiting sudden behavioral changes, withdrawal from friends, declining grades, and an extreme fear of being alone with male teachers. During our early sessions, Sarah reminded me so intensely of my younger self that I sometimes had to excuse myself to the restroom to regain my composure. She had the same hypervigilance, the same careful way of speaking that revealed nothing while saying everything, the same desperate hope that someone would notice her pain and make it stop. It took 3 months of patient work before Sarah finally found the courage to tell me about her stepfather's special bedtime stories. Stories that involved photographing her in ways that left her feeling dirty and ashamed. Dr. Sullivan. She asked me after one particularly difficult session, "How do you know exactly what questions to ask? How do you understand what's happening to me when everyone else just thinks I'm being difficult?" I looked at this brave girl who was fighting so hard to reclaim her voice, and I made a decision that went against everything I had been taught about professional boundaries. "Because something very similar happened to me when I was about your age," I told her gently. "And I want you to know that what's happening to you is not your fault, and it doesn't define who you are or who you can become." Her eyes widened with a mixture of shock and relief. "Really? You're okay now?" "I'm more than okay," I said honestly. "I'm happy. I'm married to a wonderful man who loves and respects me. I have work that gives my life meaning. And most importantly, I learned that the people who hurt us don't get to write the ending of our story. We do." Working with Child Protective Services and local law enforcement, we were able to remove Sarah from the dangerous situation and ensure her stepfather was prosecuted. The day I watched him being led away in handcuffs was one of the most satisfying moments of my professional career. But the real victory came months later when Sarah looked me in the eye and said, "I'm not going to let what he did to me stop me from having a good life. Just like you didn't. In the spring of 1989, 20 years after I had left Hartford, I received a letter that would change my understanding of my own story forever. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name made my heart skip. Emma Sullivan. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. "Dear Margaret," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I obtained your address through the university directory. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. My name is Emma Sullivan Morrison, and I believe you knew my father, Dr. Richard Sullivan. I'm writing because I recently learned some disturbing things about my father's past, and my mother believes you were the person who wrote to warn her about him when I was 6 years old. If so, I cannot adequately express my gratitude. Your courage may have saved my life. My father died 3 months ago of a massive heart attack. After his funeral, my mother finally told me about the anonymous letter she received years ago, warning her that my father had been abusing his other daughter. She said your letter made her watch me more carefully, and when she noticed some concerning behaviors, she made the difficult decision to separate from him permanently. I never understood why my parents' marriage ended so suddenly when I was young, or why I saw my father so rarely after that. Now I know it was because someone, I believe it was you, found the courage to speak up when speaking up was dangerous. I'm a social worker now, specializing in child protection. I think about the anonymous person who saved me almost every day. If you're willing, I would very much like to meet you." The letter was signed with her married name and included a phone number in New Haven. I read the letter 3 times before David found me sitting at our kitchen table, tears streaming down my face. "What is it?" he asked, immediately concerned. I handed him the letter and watched his expression change as he read. Margaret," he said softly, "this is incredible. She became a social worker just like you became a psychologist. You both found ways to transform your experiences into something that helps other children. She wants to meet me. Do you want to meet her?" I thought about it carefully. For 20 years, Emma had existed in my mind, more as a symbol than a real person. The little girl I had saved, the child who had escaped the fate I had endured. The idea of meeting her as an adult, of seeing who she had become, was both exciting and terrifying. "Yes," I said finally. "I think I do." 2 weeks later, Emma flew out to Portland at my invitation. I wanted to meet on my home territory, in a place where I felt safe and strong. I suggested we meet at a quiet coffee shop near the university, somewhere public, but intimate enough for the conversation I knew we needed to have. I recognized her immediately when she walked through the door, even though she was now 26 years old. She had our father's dark hair and sharp intelligence, but there was a warmth in her eyes that he had never possessed. When she smiled nervously and waved, I saw nothing of him in her expression, only the woman she had chosen to become. Margaret," she said, approaching my table tentatively. "Emma." I stood, and following an impulse I couldn't explain, pulled her into a hug. She felt small in my arms, and I was overwhelmed by a protectiveness toward this young woman who could have been me in another life. We talked for hours. Emma told me about her childhood after her mother had left our father, about growing up knowing she had a half-sister somewhere, but never being told the full truth. She spoke about her education at Smith College, her work with Child Protective Services in Connecticut, and her recent engagement to a man named Michael, who sounded remarkably like David, kind, supportive, and completely trustworthy. "I have to ask you something difficult," she said eventually, her professional composure wavering slightly. "What our father did to you. How severe was it? I need to understand what I was saved from." I told her the truth, though. I softened some of the most graphic details. She listened with the trained calm of someone who worked with trauma survivors professionally, but I could see the pain and anger in her eyes as she realized the full scope of what she had been spared. "I'm so sorry," she said when I finished. "I'm sorry you endured that, and I'm sorry you had to carry that burden alone for so many years." "I'm not sorry I wrote that letter," I said firmly. "Even if it had cost me everything, you deserved to be protected. You deserved to have a childhood free from that kind of terror." "You saved my life," she said simply. And then You went on to save the lives of countless other children through your work. You transformed something unspeakably horrible into a force for good in the world. Before she returned to Connecticut, Emma made a request that surprised me. I know this might sound presumptuous. She said, "But would you consider being my matron of honor when Michael and I get married this fall? I know we've just met, but you're the reason I have a life worth celebrating. It would mean everything to me if you could be there." 6 months later, I stood beside Emma at her wedding in a beautiful garden in Connecticut, holding her bouquet as she married a man who clearly adored and cherished her. During the reception, she pulled me aside and handed me a small, wrapped gift. Inside was a silver locket engraved with the words, "To Margaret, who taught me that speaking up can save lives. With love and gratitude, Emma." Inside the locket was a photo of us from the wedding, 2 women connected by tragedy, but celebrating in triumph. Emma and I maintained regular contact after her wedding, speaking by phone weekly and visiting each other several times a year. We often consulted on difficult cases, combining my clinical expertise with her field experience in child protection. It was during one of these collaborations 3 years after we first met that we stumbled upon a discovery that would bring our story full circle in ways I never could have imagined. Emma had been working with a particularly challenging case, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus, whose symptoms suggested severe ongoing abuse, but who refused to identify his abuser or provide any details about what was happening to him. "There's something about this case that feels familiar," Emma told me during one of our phone consultations. "The boy's fear is so specific. He's terrified of medical examinations, panics when he sees anyone in a white coat, and has night terrors that involve someone giving him medicine to make him sleep." The details made my blood run cold. "What do you know about his family situation?" "He lives with his mother and stepfather. The stepfather is actually a physician, Dr. James Morrison. He's quite well regarded in the community, took over a practice from a colleague who died a few years ago." The name hit me like a physical blow. "Emma, what was the name of the colleague he took over from?" There was a pause as I heard her flipping through papers. "Dr. Richard Sullivan, why—" She stopped abruptly as the implications sank in. "Oh my God, you think Dr. Morrison might have learned more than just medical procedures from our father?" "I think it's very possible." What followed was the most difficult and dangerous investigation of either of our careers. Working carefully within the system, we began building a case against Dr. Morrison that eventually revealed something far more sinister than we had imagined. Morrison wasn't just a single predator who had learned techniques from my father. He was part of an organized network of physicians who had been systematically abusing children for decades, protecting each other through professional connections and sharing strategies for avoiding detection. The investigation expanded to include a review of my father's old patient files and appointment records. Those cryptic notations I had seen in his calendar as a child, special consultations, pediatric protocols, family considerations, were code words for coordinated abuse involving multiple perpetrators. Several other survivors came forward during the investigation, adults now, who had been victimized as children by various members of the network. Their stories revealed a pattern of abuse that had been hidden in plain sight within the medical community for years. When the case finally went to trial, I was called to testify about the patterns I had observed in my father's behavior and the techniques he had used to silence and control me. Standing in that courtroom, speaking publicly for the first time about what had happened to me, was terrifying. But it was also profoundly liberating. No longer was I protecting anyone's reputation or maintaining anyone's secrets. I was finally using my voice to ensure justice for other victims. Dr. Sullivan. The prosecutor asked me, "In your professional opinion, could the systematic abuse perpetrated by this network have been prevented if proper oversight mechanisms had been in place?" "Absolutely," I replied firmly. Children are often afraid to speak up about abuse, especially when the perpetrator is someone in a position of authority like a physician. But there are warning signs that trained professionals can recognize, and there are systems we can implement to protect vulnerable children. We have a moral obligation to do better. The convictions that resulted from the trial led to significant reforms in medical oversight and child protection protocols. More importantly, they brought justice for dozens of victims who had suffered in silence for years. The trial's aftermath brought an unexpected visitor to my office at the university. I was reviewing case files one afternoon when my secretary announced that a Mrs. Helen Sullivan was requesting to see me. My mother stood in my doorway looking every one of her 72 years, her once perfectly styled hair now gray and thin, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her purse. "Hello, Margaret," she said quietly. "Mother." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Please, sit down." She settled herself carefully, looking around my office with its diplomas and awards, its shelves filled with books on trauma and recovery. "I saw the news coverage of the trial," she said finally. "I saw you testifying about what your father did." I waited, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I need you to know," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I suspected. Deep down, in the part of myself I worked so hard to silence, I knew something was wrong." The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. "But I was so afraid," she went on, tears beginning to fall. "Afraid of losing my home, my social standing, my financial security. Afraid of admitting I had married a monster. Afraid that if I acknowledged what was happening, I would have to do something about it, and I didn't think I was strong enough." "Mother." "No, let me finish. Please." She looked up at me with eyes full of pain and regret. "I failed you, Margaret. I failed in the most fundamental way a mother can fail. I chose my comfort over your safety, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life." I had imagined this conversation countless times over the years, but the reality of it was more complex than any scenario I had envisioned. Looking at this broken woman who had been my mother, I felt not the anger I had expected, but a profound sadness for all the ways we had both been victims of my father's manipulation. "I forgive you," I said quietly, and was surprised to realize I meant it. "Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying anger toward you was hurting me more than it was hurting you." She cried, then deep sobs that seemed to come from decades of suppressed guilt and grief. When she finally composed herself, she asked the question I had been dreading. "Can you ever forgive me enough to let me be part of your life? I know I don't deserve it, but you're my daughter, and I love you more than I was ever brave enough to show." It took me several years to answer that question fully. Mother and I began meeting occasionally for lunch, carefully rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged but not completely destroyed. She never met David. She died of cancer 2 years later, but she did live long enough to see me receive a national award for my work in child protection. "I'm proud of who you became," she told me during our last conversation. "You succeeded in spite of me, not because of me, and that makes your achievements even more remarkable." The work that emerged from the Morrison trial extended far beyond individual convictions. Emma and I were invited to develop training protocols for medical schools, teaching future physicians how to recognize signs of abuse and create safe environments for children to report it. We also began speaking at conferences across the country, sharing our story with audiences of professionals, survivors, and advocates. Our presentation, titled "Breaking the Silence: A Sister's Journey from Victim to Advocate," became one of the most requested workshops in the field. But perhaps our most important work was the establishment of the Sullivan Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to preventing child abuse within professional settings. The foundation funded research, provided training, and advocated for policy changes that would make it harder for predators to hide behind professional credentials. It was through this work that I met Dr. Patricia Morrison, Emma's mother, and my father's second wife at a conference in Boston where we were all speaking about child protection. When Emma introduced us, I saw immediate recognition in Patricia's eyes. "You're the one who wrote the letter," she said simply. "Yes?" She pulled me into a fierce embrace that caught me completely off guard. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being brave enough to warn me. Thank you for saving my daughter." Later, as the three of us sat together over dinner, Patricia shared her side of the story. I knew something was wrong almost from the beginning of my marriage to Richard, she said. He was obsessive about certain aspects of Emma's care, insisting on bathing her personally, reading her bedtime stories alone, behind closed doors, becoming angry if I tried to interrupt these special times they had together. What made you finally act? I asked. Your letter. When I read it, everything clicked into place. All those moments when my maternal instincts had screamed warnings, all those times I had pushed down my concerns because he was a respected doctor. Suddenly, it all made sense. She had confronted my father immediately, she told us, and his reaction had confirmed her worst fears. Instead of being horrified by the accusations, he became defensive and angry. He accused me of being paranoid, of trying to damage his relationship with his daughter. That's when I knew the letter was telling the truth. Patricia had taken Emma and left that same day, filing for divorce and ensuring my father never had unsupervised access to Emma again. I'm sorry you had to go through that, I told her. Don't apologize. Be proud. You gave me the information I needed to protect my child. Without your letter, I might have ignored my instincts, and Emma might have suffered the way you did. As I listened to Patricia's story, I realized something profound. My decision to speak up hadn't just saved Emma. It had given her mother the courage to trust her instincts and act on her fears. Sometimes, the most important thing we can do is give someone else permission to believe what they already know to be true. As I write this memoir at the age of 78, I look back on a life that has been shaped by trauma, but ultimately defined by healing purpose and love. David and I celebrated our 42nd wedding anniversary last month, surrounded by colleagues, former students, and young people whose lives have been touched by our work. We never had children of our own, a decision we made together after careful consideration of how my childhood experiences might affect my ability to parent without constantly fearing for their safety. But we have mentored dozens of students and young professionals, many of whom we consider part of our extended family. Emma is now the executive director of the Connecticut Child Advocacy Center, and she has 2 daughters who call me Aunt Margaret. Watching her with her children, seeing the easy affection and healthy boundaries she maintains, fills me with a pride I can barely describe. She broke the cycle that could have continued through generations. The training programs Emma and I developed are now used in medical schools and social work programs across the country. We estimate that our protocols have directly contributed to the identification and protection of more than 300 children, and have trained thousands of professionals to better recognize and respond to signs of abuse. Last year, I received a letter from a young pediatrician in Seattle who had attended one of our training sessions during her residency. She wrote to tell me that our presentation had helped her recognize signs of abuse in one of her young patients, and that her intervention had led to the child's removal from a dangerous situation and the prosecution of the perpetrator. You probably don't remember me from the training, she wrote, but your story changed the way I practice medicine. Thank you for having the courage to speak up both as a child and as an adult. You've saved more lives than you'll ever know. Letters like that remind me why the pain was worth it. Every survivor who finds their voice, every child who is protected because someone recognized the warning signs, every professional who chooses to act instead of look away, they are all part of the ripple effect that began with a terrified 17-year-old girl writing a letter to warn a stranger about the danger her father posed. I still live in Portland in the same house David and I bought as newlyweds, though I rattled around in it alone after David passed peacefully last year, following a brief battle with lung cancer. The garden is smaller now than it used to be, but it still blooms every spring with the roses and lavender I learned to love during those early days of freedom. Emma visits regularly, often bringing her daughters to help me tend the flowers. As I watch them play in the yard, where they might have played in different circumstances, I'm struck by the complete absence of fear in their lives. They run and laugh and explore their world with the confidence that comes from knowing the adults in their lives exist solely to protect and nurture them. When they ask me to tell them stories about when I was little, which they do with increasing frequency as they grow older, I find myself in a position I never expected to occupy. I tell them about learning to be brave, about the importance of speaking up when something feels wrong, about how sometimes doing the right thing requires us to be scared and do it anyway. Huh. Were you always brave, Aunt Margaret? Emma's eldest daughter Sarah asked me recently as we planted tulip bulbs for next spring's garden. No, sweetheart, I told her honestly. I was frightened for a very long time, but I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you do what's right, even when you are afraid. These days, I spend my time writing not research papers or training materials, but letters to survivors who reach out to me through the foundation, and working on this memoir that has taken me 3 years to complete. There is something profoundly healing about transforming years of silence into words that might help someone else find their voice. I also serve on several boards dedicated to child protection, and I continue to speak at conferences when my health permits. At 78, I've become something of an elder stateswoman in the field of trauma recovery, though some days I still feel like that frightened little girl counting ceiling cracks in the darkness. The difference now is that I know that darkness doesn't last forever. I know that speaking up, even when it terrifies us, can save lives. I know that survivors can not only heal, but can use their experiences to create light for others still trapped in that darkness. My father's house on Elm Street was demolished years ago to make room for a community center that offers after-school programs and counseling services for at-risk children. Sometimes, when I'm visiting Emma in Connecticut, I drive past the location where it once stood. There's a playground there now, bright and cheerful, filled with the kind of joyful noise that house never knew. I think my father would hate knowing that his legacy isn't the medical practice he was so proud of or the reputation he guarded so carefully, but the network of child protection systems that grew out of exposing his crimes. He thought he could control the story by keeping us silent. He never imagined that breaking that silence would create something larger and more powerful than anything he had built. The fountain pen he gave me for graduation still sits on my desk, though the engraving has worn smooth with age and use. I've used it to write countless letters advocating for legislative changes, to sign reports that led to the prosecution of abusers, and to pen the words that have helped other survivors find their voices. He was right about one thing: I did do important things with words, just not in the way he ever imagined. As I finish this memoir, I'm reminded of something Emma said to me at her wedding all those years ago. You taught me that speaking up can save lives. It's a lesson I learned the hardest way possible, but one I'm grateful to pass on. To anyone reading this who has experienced abuse or witnessed it happening to someone else, I want you to know your voice matters. Your truth has power. Speaking up is frightening, but silence protects only those who hurt the innocent. You deserve to be believed, to be supported, and to be safe. And to that terrified 7-year-old girl, I used to be counting ceiling cracks in the dark. While waiting for morning, you survived. You found your voice. You used your pain to protect other children and change the world in small but meaningful ways. The man who hurt you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. You do. Dr. Margaret Sullivan is Professor Emerita of Clinical Psychology at Portland State University and co-founder of the Sullivan Foundation for Child Protection. She has authored numerous articles on trauma recovery and child advocacy and continues to speak nationally on issues of abuse prevention and survivor empowerment. She lives in Portland, Oregon.